Welcome back to For All the Saints with me, Paul Sutton, and also a special guest here today, Paul Bolton. Welcome, Paul, and we're looking forward to chatting about some objections to children in church with you. Just tell us a bit about where you are and how we know each other, that sort of thing.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I'm in Headington, which is a suburb of Oxford. We've got to know each other really, I think, over the last year or two. Both are kind of going on a very similar track into the International Presbyterian Church. So I'm currently the Minister for Children and Families at St Ebbs Headington, which is itself a plant from St Ebbs in the centre of Oxford 23 years ago. And we, that is St Ebbs Headington, are looking to plant into the kind of eastern end of our suburb of Headington, a bit towards London, in September, like you are, a group, I think, of a similar size to the number that are coming from St Leonard's. And I'm leading that.
And how are the preparations and plans for that going? Are you feeling vaguely on top of things, or?
Yeah, it does feel like a very long list of things to do. But I think, again, similar stage, we've got charity registration like you have. I think similar stage in terms of venues. We've got a possible venue that's maybe not quite ideal, but could work. Maybe one or two other irons in the fire. Really looking for things to become clear on that front. I'm carrying on doing my current job until the end of May, and then I've got 3 months kind of clear to get things underway for the 1st of September, which is when we launch.
Great. We're praying for you in our prayer meetings, and thanks for praying for us in yours.
Yeah, likewise, yeah.
So you mentioned that you're currently working as a Minister for Children and Families. I take it that involves running Sunday school things during the service and stuff like that. We're talking about this off the back of the last podcast where I was laying out really my developed convictions of the scriptures about how actually we want children to be coming before God in worship. Can you just describe a bit of your own sort of history, your journey, if you like?
Yeah. Well, we've got children of our own. So our eldest are now, they're going to be 8, they're going to turn 18 this summer. We have 17-year-old twins, girls, a boy of 15 and a half, and then a girl of 11. And they've grown up at Ebbs Headington. And at Ebbs Headington, we have children's groups up to the age of 11. And actually, we've always been very grateful that they don't go beyond that. I think a lot of churches will go on to sort of 14, even to 18. And that feels very late for kids to be making that switch.
Yeah.
Whereas actually when they're 11, they're still at that stage, well, going to big church is exciting and good to be with the parents and the adults and so on. In 2016, I had a sabbatical and we went to Florida for 3 months. That's when we started going to churches which had children in worship all the way through. And I think that was the first kind of taste of it that we got. And it was hard, particularly we had a 7-year-old boy. He was the hardest at the time, not being used to that. Actually, our little 2-year-old at the time sort of took it in her stride. So it was getting him to stop, not to wriggle and so on, and all those sorts of battles that I'm sure we'll be talking about a bit later on. But we loved it. We loved being together as a family in the Lord's presence for the whole thing. And actually the children really loved it, even the wriggly 7-year-old. And the older three were all able to sort of take notes during the sermon, and therefore that helped them to be engaged. And I think the youngest one, the 2-year-old, just liked being with us, not being shoved off somewhere with a bunch of strangers, but actually being with mummy and daddy and older siblings. So that was our first thought of, there is a different way. It doesn't have to be this model that we're kind of so used to in the UK. And then coming back, actually there were times when we did take our kids out of Sunday club even before that. So when our children were very small, they were bored in Sunday club because they were quite bright, aged sort of 4, but they were in with the 2-year-olds, and it would be God made our fingers one week, God made our noses the next week. So actually they came back into the service then for a time. And similarly, our son, when there was a time when the behavior wasn't great in his particular group, and he was part of the reason for that. But we just felt there was a culture of silliness and towards God's word, really, in that group. So for a term or two, we took him out to kind of retrain him in terms of what we're trying to do when we come to church.
Right.
And actually, that's when I then got involved in leading that group, because I wanted to help out. And it was off the back of leading that in 2020, I became the Children and Families Minister, switched job at that point, and joined the staff team. It was during COVID, so we didn't have anything straight away. Gave us a chance to rethink what we did. And we did go back into the model of children being out, but we shaped it more like a church service, actually. We are trying to train people for worship, for corporate worship, for being in the main service with everyone else.
Yeah.
So we'd sing, reading, prayers, talk, and then go into different age groups. And that's the current model that we run at Ept Headington. We have one family that keep their kids in the service, and that's been wonderful to see and a great model in terms of showing what's possible. Yeah.
So that's kind of the biographical, like your experience of it. What about, have there been convictions of yours that have developed alongside that?
Probably two main convictions that have kind of come together. One is a conviction about what we do when we come to church and what the purpose of meeting together as God's people is. And I'd now be convinced that the primary purpose for that is worship, to be in the presence of the Lord, enjoying communion with him. I think I had grown up in a culture that said it's primarily sort of horizontal. It's about us being built up, building each other up. It's about evangelism. So quite functional, really. And therefore, you can assess a service by how successful, how much information we've received, how much kind of encouragement or challenge we've received for living the Christian life, how clearly the gospel has been explained to non-believers, how many non-believers are there, those sorts of things. And actually, going back to the scriptures, really through a combination of things, I think going to America, that experience of worship in America, actually teaching the doctrine of church on a local ministry training course and rethinking things each time I did that, doing some wider reading, not just from one particular kind of band of the church, but from the breadth of the church and from the depth in terms of history, helped me to see that actually this view of church as primarily horizontal is quite a minority report in the history of the church. And yes. And actually you go to the scriptures, and it's clear that we can't say, oh, in the Old Testament worship was just in the temple and the tabernacle and not in the rest of life. I mean, the New Testament, suddenly it's the rest of life. No. In the Old Testament, they were very clear that we live all of life, coram deo, in the presence of the Lord, that we're called to offer ourselves, all of us, all of our time to the Lord. And yet, when we meet together as God's people, we are coming into the house of the Lord. We're meeting in his presence. And in the New Testament, similarly, yes, all of life is meant to be full of worship. Yet when we come together, Acts very clearly uses that word worship of what happens when God's people come together. And if we're in the presence of God, that's the key thing, is the presence of God. If you're in the presence of God, what do? You bow down. That's what worship means.
Yeah, I mean, really similarly, the same for me, that conviction about what we are doing when we gather, primarily to encounter, to worship God. I guess I'd previously thought that was wholly Old Testament and sort of typological thing that had now passed away. And obviously, the details and some of the key details of Old Testament worship have passed away. We don't have blood sacrifices for a reason, which is that the final sacrifice has been made. But yeah, there's a general worship of all of our lives, but there has always been a special worship ever since, well, at least since Cain and Abel brought their special offerings, which nobody had told them to do. They just knew, oh, well, if there really is a God, then I owe him the best, and that will be the best thing. Anyway, so that was the first thing then. So
and then the other strand would be about the status of children within God's people. I think this is probably a deeper conviction. I've had this conviction longer, as in I've been a Pedo Baptist since university days. But I think having your own children and bringing them up as believers within the covenant deepens that conviction. And if they are part of God's people, what do God's people do? Well, God's people gather for worship. So why exclude them from that? So I think it was those two things coming together. And, thinking of Christ Church Headington, which is what our new plant's going to be called, I'm in the middle of thinking, so, okay, what does that mean for our children's work? And I think we're thinking we'll do something similar to what I think your plans are, which is we want it to be a positive decision by parents, that they want their kids to be with them in worship. And therefore, I think we will offer some sort of children group, probably just for the sermon, up to probably a slightly younger age than we do currently. But we want to then be helping parents to see that this is possible and how to do this. Because it does feel quite alien, I think, for those of us who've grown up in evangelical churches in the UK. And therefore, I want to sort of help people to see how to do that, some of the practicalities of that, why it's worth doing it, and to give it a go and see how it goes.
Yes. Well, that transitions us nicely onto sort of really what I wanted to talk about today, which is objections, really. I'm just thinking, I like you, I've been thinking about this for several years, but I can well imagine that people listening to this have thought, hang on a second, like I've been thinking about this for several days at most, and here immediately I've thought of these 5 objections, and I think they're all, I suppose I want to say that they're all perfectly reasonable objections, at least on the face of them, and ones that we want to like you've just said about how you want people to make a positive decision and see this as something that, not that they have to do, but that they want to do, at least in theory, even if the practice kind of is harder than that. So should we dive into some objections? And the first one, which in some ways is, I think we'll cover a number of different angles on this, is it's too hard. I just can't do this. That could be because my child has some special educational needs, or it could just be, I don't think my child will sit still for an hour left. I can't do it. It's too hard. What would be your thoughts on that objection?
Yeah, I think, the special educational needs, I might just leave to one side for a moment, because it's a very complicated issue and there'll be a whole range of different needs. On the it's too hard question, I guess just because something is hard, it is hard. We need to acknowledge that. I said it was hard for us when we went out to America.
Yeah.
We took our 7-year-old in. Just because it's hard doesn't mean it's not worth doing. There are lots of things that are hard in parenting that we still do. Getting up in the middle of the night to feed our baby is hard, but we do it because it's the right thing to do. Teaching our children to be obedient is really hard, but most parents, certainly most Christian parents, would agree that's worth doing.
Yeah.
And over time, precisely because the children are learning, precisely because they are in that sort of putty-like stage where actually they're born sort of obviously sinful, but also with that natural inclination to follow their parents' lead, it does get easier. I think probably the most obviously hard years for teaching children to be in worship are those toddler years. We might think a bit about how we can make it a bit easier, but actually it would be a mistake to think that once my kids are sitting still in church, I've got it cracked, therefore they're worshipping. Actually, that process of training our children to worship goes on. We're still doing it with our oldest teenagers, and making sure they're not just engaged with their lips outwardly, but engaged with their hearts, as far as we're able to do that and encourage that. As parents, we want to train our children in godliness, and a central plank of godliness is surely worship. Just because it's hard, that isn't a good enough reason. If it's worth doing, it's worth the pain.
And I think, just to riff on that idea that it's hard but it's good, I do think that coming to church is hard as an adult. Either because I'm always horribly convicted by that verse in Hebrews which talks about, today if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts, because it's incredibly easy to do and the warnings are so severe. I often think during our intercessions in church, it is really hard work to engage well with public intercessions. And I remember someone when I was at theological college, one of the lecturers saying he had become convinced that not engaging properly as a participant in the church service with the intercessions was a sin. And I was like, what? Hang on a second. But I think the more you think about it, you think, yeah, actually, it is really hard work, even as an adult, even with the very best intercessions, to track with it. And if it's hard for us, well, presumably it's hard for children, but the fact that it's hard doesn't mean we shouldn't do it.
No, and I think there are things that can make it a bit easier and that can help both from the parental point of view and from the church and the church leader, how they can make it easier. So I think as parents, thinking ahead, so preparing beforehand, communicating with our children why we go to church, why it's such a big deal, why we're so excited as parents to be going to church ourselves, perhaps talking through with them the elements of the service and what's going to happen and what things to look out for. This family that have their children in with us at the moment, they sit right at the front of church, and that's brilliant because it really helps their little children to be engaged with what's going on, rather than, I think the temptation is to think, we need to sit near the back, so if there's a problem I can whisk them out without embarrassment. Don't worry about embarrassment. It's, parenting is full of lots of embarrassments. I'm sure we could spend all morning exchanging different stories of embarrassing situations with our children. But the great thing about being near the front is that they're there, they're engaged, they can see what's going on, they can have eye contact with the minister. Obviously, you've got a service sheet. That's great because they can sort of see if they're readers, they can see where they are, where the service is progressing. I think, and then just little words of explanation and encouragement during the service. We're going to open the Bible, we're going to hear God speak to us now. Just a little word in their ear to remind them what's happening. And then obviously to kind of say, well done, when they stand up and sing well in a song. Then there are other things like that. Some parents will use food, a little odd raisin to keep the child going, a soft toy or something. I don't want these things to be distractions, but if they can be aids. And I think, because again, that I talked before about the joy of being together as a family. So just the physical contact, a little child on your lap. So much of our time, when I take the little scramblers group at our church, which is sort of 2, 3, 4-year-olds, so much of the time is spent trying to kind of stop children crying who all they want to do is be with their parents.
Wow.
And the great thing is, the children in worship, they're there with their parents. So having them on your lap, or just if they're a bit older, an arm on their shoulder, letting them lean against you, that physical contact, I think, can make it into a very special mummy and daddy time. And obviously, they can learn to take notes and so forth. So I think there are things that make it easier as a church, as parents. And then I think as a church and a church leader, we need to think through, okay, how do we make our services not child-centered or child-focused in the kind of traditional all-age, well, not that traditional, but the
traditional, yeah.
the all-age service kind of phenomenon, but bearing children in mind as we prepare our leading and our sermons. So child-friendly, child-accessible illustrations, applications, stories, occasionally turning to address the children. I remember going to a church where children were in the service, and the minister got all the children to draw. They had a sort of sermon sheet to draw a picture of something they're scared of. And then a couple of minutes later, he said, now look back at that picture. Jesus is bigger than that thing that you're scared of. And it's just that way of just helping the children to hear God's word and to earth it in their experience and their lives. I actually think if you're a liturgical church, it helps, because there are bits where people are involved and, saying the Lord's Prayer very quickly. A young child who can't read can learn the words of the Lord Prayer or the confession. I remember we took our twins to a family wedding, when they were about, probably about 2. I was actually taking the wedding, and after the first hymn, I got up to give the nice prayer book preamble to the wedding service, and suddenly these 2 little voices are calling out, sorry God, because they know that in a service, the first thing you do after you've praised the Lord is to confess your sin. And made me think, why don't we do that in a wedding service? Why do we just plow straight on? Why don't we think we need to come into the presence of the Lord? We need to confess our sin. But it's just that way that liturgy, and just the habits of worship Sunday by Sunday teach us the whole shape of the gospel, actually, and the shape of our relationship with the Lord.
Yeah. And so we were just having this conversation in our family yesterday that my second daughter, who's 4, was, she usually sits with us in the service, and so yesterday was the Lord's Supper, and she's very fascinated by the Lord's Supper, and yesterday she was saying, like, when can I receive the Lord's Supper, and like those sorts of questions, and I'll come on to that in a subsequent podcast episode, but so we don't need to kind of go into the weeds of it now. But the point I'm making is more that children really do engage with that sort of thing, and I think one of the strange things about a church which sends the children out from, say, the start of the service or near the start or just before the sermon, and then they're picked up at the end, is you really could get to age 14 having almost never even witnessed, let alone received the Lord's Supper. And, if the Lord's Supper is what the Bible says it is, a means by which God blesses us, that strikes me as a very strange thing. Well, why don't we come to the other version of it being hard, which is it's hard for, I suppose, more objective reasons, that, a child who has special educational needs, that sort of thing. What about that? Yeah,
and I think it's very hard, if not impossible, to generalize, because some needs are so great that actually I'm conscious of a family that I know here in Oxford who they're not all able to be at church at the same time because the needs are so great of the child that needs caring for physically at home. That said, I think one of the positive things about having children in a service, and therefore a bit more noise, a bit more untidiness and so on, is that actually it does make it easier for families with those with additional special needs to be in the service and not to feel like they're the odd ones out, and to give room for children who struggle in whatever way, and actually for adults as well who perhaps have additional needs. The church is for the whole people of God. We're all made in God's image, and actually having a service where, like I said, we don't mind noise, we don't mind people having to go out and come back in again, that actually can make church much more accessible for all sorts of people, not just children actually. But if we have a culture where the default is we want people to be in church, whoever they are, whatever their age, whatever their needs, then that can then actually facilitate those conversations and make it much more viable.
Yeah. Increasingly, the more I realize how precious and just good and the real pinnacle of the Christian life the gathered church is meant to be, the more I want to say to people, find a way to get here. Whether you're somebody who's old and needs someone to pick you up from the care home where you live, like we want to find a way for that to happen. And the same is true of parents of children with special needs. There is a graciousness that's required to say, look, we totally recognize that there are times of periods in life, potentially long periods in life, where it just isn't realistically possible, or you're going to have to tag team week by week with your spouse, or let's say, or even you can't. Like if you're a single parent of a severely disabled child, like getting to church at all is going to be immensely difficult. But I'm always full of admiration in churches where I've been members of before, of parents who have made that a priority of bringing their child. And I don't think people mind. I think, people would often feel, as they do with their noisy toddlers, other people will be grumpy about the fact that they're making noise and stuff. And I don't think people do.
No, and again, we might go on to this, but if they do, it's a great way to learn to bear with one another in love, which is what church is all about.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. And next objection then. Church is not age appropriate for small children. They can't understand what's going on. And maybe beyond that, it's just boring for them. What would you say to that?
Thanks. Well, I think God clearly thinks it is age appropriate, because both in the Old Testament, Deuteronomy 31, and the New Testament, Ephesians 6, the expectation is that children will be present in corporate worship. So, I think the Lord knows better than us on these things. And yes, there'll be lots that a child won't understand when they first come to church, just as there'll be lots that an unbeliever might not understand, or a young Christian might not understand. There's stuff that I don't understand often when I'm, reading a particular passage in the Bible or hearing it read. But they won't grow to understand worship by being excluded from worship. So think about how a child learns to speak. When I'm holding my one-day-old baby in my arms, I don't think to myself, well, this child doesn't understand anything I say to it, so I'm not going to speak to it. Of course I speak to it, because the way that it learns to speak is by hearing words that initially mean nothing to it. But over time, as the brain develops, it's able to understand. And there's so much non-verbal communication that goes on as well, isn't there? So when I'm holding my baby in my arms, saying to it, I love you, of course the baby doesn't understand what I love you means. But that doesn't mean it isn't able at a very young age to pick up the kind of non-verbal communication of that love. And I think that's especially true in public worship, because public worship isn't a purely verbal or intellectual activity. And again, I think there's something that's changed in my own thinking about worship for myself. I think I used to think it was about downloading as much information as I could from God into my brain. Oh great, I've understood another passage of the Bible, I can tick that one off, or it's given me a bit more encouragement to live the Christian life this week. No, it's much more than that. Public worship. It's a corporate, personal, spiritual encounter with the Lord. And while our children may not be able to grasp some of the more complex theological words or concepts in our songs or liturgy or sermons, they can still absorb so much. The atmosphere of worship, its importance, its wonder, and the centrality of Christ to all of those things. You're just being in a house full of books shapes a child to be a book lover.
Yeah.
Long before they can actually read. So being in the house of worship shapes a child to be a worshipper long before they understand even what worship is. Frankly, I don't. It's a mystery. There's a mystery to worship, isn't there, for all of us? And I think we can misjudge and underestimate a children's ability to understand, and actually just misunderstand that miss that whole spiritual dimension of what's going on. Little parents brought their little children, their babies, to be blessed by Jesus. Well, what's going on there? What is this blessing that they're experiencing? It's clearly not a verbal, not a kind of intellectual thing, because they're too little, and yet they are receiving something from the Lord. And even when it comes to the level of understanding truth, spiritual truths are spiritually discerned, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians. It's the Lord who gives insight. And therefore, I think our children will often surprise us with things that they have understood and things that they grasp and come out with. Maybe something they've heard months before in church that's lodged away and, like a seed, has been at work in their hearts, being watered by the Spirit, who is using that truth to produce spiritual life. And God promises that His word will not return to Him empty, and that's the promise that we can claim for our children as they sit under the word preached and read week by week in church.
Absolutely. I just, in some ways, children are presented in the Bible as the model worshippers. And that, I'm still trying to get my head around that, and maybe that's part of the problem. But, when Jesus speaks, I think I mentioned that in the previous episode, but in Matthew 21 and Matthew 11, about the children singing Hosanna to the Son of David, and he praises God for revealing these things to little children and hiding them from the wise and learned. They're like, well, what did they understand by Hosanna to the Son of David? They probably, if he's talking about infants who were just joining in with a song that other people around them were singing, directed in some way at Jesus, they probably didn't have a very deep understanding of it. And yet Jesus is not only saying that they were right to sing to him, he's also saying that God praises the Father for revealing these things to little children. And yeah, I'm not sure I can totally understand what that means. But
therefore, it's really helpful for us to have little children in worship ourselves, because we can look at them and learn from them in terms of that attitude of trust and joy in the Lord and so on. That's as a like a weaned child with its mother. There's that psalm, isn't there? It talks about our relationship with the Lord. So actually, when I'm to be in worship and to see a young child sitting on its mother's lap at rest, there's something there that helps me in my worship without personalizing it too much.
You mentioned earlier on the Lord's Prayer, which I think is the kind of touchstone for this in some ways, which is that, as you say, children can begin to just join in with the last word of each line or whatever, and they very quickly are able to mostly join in with the words of the Lord's Prayer. And it's easy for us to think, is it really okay for them to pray the Lord's Prayer when what understanding does my 3-year-old have of the Lord's Prayer? I think until you start asking yourself the same question, say, well, what understanding do I have of the Lord's Prayer? Like Jesus gave his disciples this particular form of words to use, very carefully constructed form of words that he expects his disciples to use. And yet it's so deep and rich that I don't know if you find this yourself, but joining with the Lord's Prayer is actually quite hard to do.
Yes, I mean, absolutely. Your kingdom come, your will be done. I'm nowhere near getting to the bottom of what those phrases mean. Yeah.
So what about it being boring? I suppose that's a slightly different angle on the same age-appropriate, can't understand type objection, but it is slightly different.
Yeah. And I think we can fear, can't we, that our children will be put off church, put off the Lord by a boring experience of church. I think what I'd say to that is that we mustn't parent out of fear, but out of faith, trusting that the Lord will use his appointed means for the good of our children. And on the boring thing, there are times when I think even as an adult, I have found church boring, and I've had to repent of that and remind myself what is going on. And I think, coming to realize the problem is actually with me rather than with worship, with what's going on. And then I need to train myself by faith to believe what is happening here, that I am actually meeting with the risen Lord Jesus, though I can't see him, and that this is an awesome and precious gift, and that I am actually receiving from him grace, even though not something I can see or feel, but to be in the presence of the risen Jesus, surrounded by his people, not to mention angels, saints in joyful assembly. That's how I need to start thinking about worship, and that will transform it for me, and it has transformed it for me actually. And then I can communicate that with my children. It's that thing of, if you take a child to a football match when they're young, they'll probably find it quite boring, 2 hours sitting out in the cold. But if they can see that their dad is absolutely excited about his team, I've got 2 of my children have ended up supporting Everton. I mean, why would you end up supporting Everton? You wouldn't, would you? Except they've got a dad who's very enthusiastic for Everton. Sadly, my wife is very enthusiastic for Liverpool. So it's probably mixed marriages.
I have to mind it, yeah.
But the point is, children will pick up our excitement or our indifference to worship. So, there's wonderful psalms about going up to the house of the Lord. Is that how we approach church on a Sunday morning? It takes a bit of thought to be in that position on a Sunday morning, if anything like our household. But if we're communicating to our children that this is exciting, that what we're doing is special, particularly as they're young, they will gain that. I don't think 2, 3-year-old, 4-year-olds, they get distracted in their minds, that they find it hard to concentrate on one thing for any length of time, but they don't find much boring in life actually. And if we can keep them engaged in different ways through the service, they'll love it. And we're blessed to have 4 children who do love going to church and don't find it boring in the least.
Yeah. And it's interesting that in the Old Testament, one of the things that is expected about children is that they'll ask their parents about Passover in particular, why do we do this stuff? And it's a kind of emerging thing for children that they start to think, hang on, why are we doing this? And thinking about the Lord's Supper perhaps is something that most closely corresponds to Passover, but it naturally raises those questions with children that they may be confused by it, but that's kind of the point, that part of how we train our children is by them seeing things that they don't understand and sort of drawing them on in their understanding of what that is, to the extent that we're able to do that ourselves. Just say a bit more about that. You mentioned at the start this little objection about boring, the thing about parenting out of fear. What do you mean by that?
As a Christian parent, you dread your child turning away from the Lord. That is my greatest fear in life, really. I think, I love them dearly. And the danger is, therefore, we spend all our time trying to think, how can I avoid that happening? And we come up with wrong answers to the question. So I think if our child isn't happy in church, or isn't, or says they're bored, oh, we're worried it's going to put them off. It's going to put them off. Therefore, let's put them into Sunday club where they're going to be more entertained and they're going to enjoy that and be with their friends and so on. And therefore, for the sake of a short-term child seeming happier being at church, we sacrifice the blessing and the benefit of actually that long-term work of them being involved in public worship. God is the one who gives new spiritual life. We can't do that for our children. What we're called to do is to obey what the Lord tells parents to do. So I don't train up my children so they won't fall away. I train up my children because that's what God has told me to do. And I'm called to be faithful and to trust the consequences to Him. And so if I'm convinced that the right place for my children to be is in public worship, that I want to train my children up as worshippers of the Lord, as the most important thing they can be, then I need to do that and leave the consequences to God. Trust Him that He will keep His promises for my children. And that's what I mean by parenting out of faith rather than out of fear. Trusting God's promises, being faithful, obedient to His calling to us as parents, rather than out of fear, thinking that I can somehow engineer something in my child's heart and life.
Two more objections. The first one, this ruins church for parents. If parents come along, they have a hard week, they or in the office or on the building site, or they come to church because they need to come to church. And if their kid's going to be there, throwing things at them for the whole service, then that ruins it for them.
Like we said, it is, it's hard. Church is hard anyway, I find, to concentrate, to make sure my heart is engaged as well as my lips. But particularly when you've got little ones you're trying to parent as well, it can be embarrassing. You're worried about, you're feeling that you're being judged for your parenting or whatever. But it is, again, it's worth it. It's that thing of, if it's worth it, it's worth doing. The troubles are temporary. The fruit is eternal. The most important job that we have to do as parents is surely to teach our children to worship. That's what we're all made for. And that's what we're trying to do the rest of the week, isn't it? To teach them to live lives of trust and obedience to the Lord. So why would we not want to do that on the most important hour of the week, the hour of public worship? In some ways, that's the most important hour of our parental week, isn't it? That's when we've got the best opportunity to teach our children to worship. So it's worth any amount of sweat and embarrassment. And actually, it isn't. It gets easier over time, and there's nothing sweeter then than for a parent to be in church with their children and actually see them engaging, singing their hearts out, scribbling down little notes or whatever, saying Amen at the end of prayers. I sometimes go and have a little sneak at what my children have written down in their sermon notebooks to see what they've to take out of a sermon. I'm always, I'm amazed by how much they get out of it, but I'm also just so encouraged to see the Lord's work in their lives. And it's actually made church, it makes church even more special to be together as a family there. So I think, yes, there is short-term pain and it is hard to concentrate. And there, even if you haven't got your kids in church, there are enough things to distract you, but the long-term results and, the benefit of it makes it worthwhile. And our children's spiritual welfare is just far more important than our personal enjoyment of a service.
Yeah. It can be a long period though, can't it? I mean, let's say you have 4 children, or you had 2 children, say, and actually you've got the first years 0 to 2 with one, and then 0 to 2 with the other, and actually by that time we only got up to age 2, so it's still a sort of difficult period. You could easily have 5 years of feeling like sort of lean years, if you like, I think particularly as a mother, but as parents in general.
I think that's right. I think it can be, a long time, but 5 years is not long in terms of a lifetime. And again, there are things that can help. And, just if you've got a good close friends who are willing to come along and help, we've been blessed with some really good friends, some single friends at church who really become part of our family and who've sat with us as a family during church, have helped us with the children when they've been difficult. I think also then setting a culture as a family. So actually the younger children pick up from the older ones. So if you get it right with the older ones, they can then set a kind of culture for their younger siblings, which can make it easier. Although you'll then get, your 4th child who is totally different from all the children you've had so far, and it feels like you're, So I thought I had this parenting thing sussed, but actually no.
Yeah, it was just random all along.
Yeah.
Okay, what about people would rightly have a concern that if we have children in the service and expect people to bring their children to keep them in the church service, that massively excludes outsiders. So if you're not a Christian, you come along to church and then it's just rubbish and you don't get it. And, this is a kind of anti-missional strategy, I guess people would say. What would you say to that?
Well, I think, we do want to be concerned about outsiders and make church accessible and friendly to them. Therefore I think it is really helpful to have some space outside the main meeting room where, if you've got a crying baby, you can go. I think we often misjudge what a non-Christian family kind of wants or expects. It's actually quite a scary thing, I think, to come into church and find your children whisked away from you. It's scary for the children. It's scary for the parents, where they don't quite know what their children are going to be, what's going to be happening to their children, what their children are going to be hearing. To actually be able to sit together in a service and feel comfortable with that, because there are plenty of other families that are doing the same, and there are plenty of other children making a bit of noise. I actually think that can be a lot more comfortable and less of a hurdle for a non-Christian family coming in. And actually in a culture that's kind of very sort of divided by age, we're all put into age groups for all sorts of things. There's something deeply attractive in being in a church that's all ages together, and in an activity that keeps the family together rather than splitting them up by age. So I think we can overestimate, I think we can misunderstand actually what a non-Christian family coming in are looking for.
Yeah, I'd never thought of that, actually. You're right. And just think of one of my friends who's planting a church down in Plymouth, and in a pretty deprived part of the city. He's ended up having a combination of his own convictions, but just the sheer practicality of, he's in this area of the city where people would think it very odd if you whisked off their children. It's much more normal for them to just stay together. Okay, it's a bit chaotic, but it works. And as you say, the fact that it's chaotic for other people sort of makes that less anxiety inducing for them, I think.
And I think with a lot of these questions, we're asking, what about this group? What about that group? What about the other? We are kind of missing the nature and purpose of worship, which is to glorify God, not to educate or inform or entertain, or even primarily to edify or evangelize. If we assess the value of a service by what we get out of it, or what a particular group gets out of it, we're being kind of profoundly man-centered about it. And actually that turns it into a worship service of ourselves rather than a worship service of the Lord. Whereas if we get that right, then the picture of the Bible seems to be that there'll be all these wonderful spin-offs as a result. Yes, we'll be built up in the faith. Yes, the unbeliever will come in and say, surely the Lord is in your midst. So it's keeping that kind of God-centeredness about what we're trying to do, rather than worrying about this group, that group, that group. Let's worry, in inverted commas, about the Lord, about pleasing him, about worshipping him in the way that he wants us to, delighting in his presence, and all these other things will be added unto you.
Yeah, thank you. I just to reassure everyone listening that, Paul is a little further on in this just because of how old his children are, but he's been through the trenches on this. I certainly am still in the trenches on this, and the Lord has enough grace for every single one of all of us with all of our objections, and we're going to need it, which is why we have to keep crying out to for help in it. And I suppose it's worth just repeating that it's taken us a while to get to that place, and maybe there's something that listeners have only been thinking about for 2 weeks. And keep chatting about it. I'd be happy to talk about it with anyone.
And it is hard, and it is tiring, and there'll be times you'll think, "What on earth are we doing? We shouldn't, this has been a mistake." But I find that so many things in life actually, and you just need to persevere. Just with parenting, with our own kids, in terms of discipline and training them in obedience. There've been times where it's felt like we're making no progress at all. It's the same battles. Months later, we found ourselves in bed at night weeping together and praying for our kids because we feel like we've kind of hit a brick wall. And then a few more months go by and you think, oh, this isn't the issue that it once was. So I think, it's why there are all these agricultural metaphors for ministry, aren't there, in the Bible, like farming, ministry, and this is a form of ministry, training our kids to worship. It takes time. You reap, you sow, and sometimes you sow in tears. But then, a season or two later, there is a wonderful harvest of joy. And that's as much true of training our kids and for worship as it is of any other aspect of our parenting.
And any other aspect of our Christian life. I mean, God is consistently telling us through the circumstances of our lives, are you going to carry on trusting me? Are you actually going to call out to me for strength? Because you're not going to do it any other way. And when we think about it, that's just the way it should be. Well, thank you very much, Paul. And it's been massively helpful to me to talk about this, and hopefully to others too. If anyone wants to follow up on this with me, then do get in touch. Paul@allsaintsexeter.org. And thanks very much for joining me, Paul.
Thank you.